Portal Raids by Matt Edsand. Narrated by Matt Edsand. Chapter 1, UHA Embassy, Capital One. Marine Captain Richards glanced around the road. He was standing outside the UHA Embassy. It was the first one that had been allowed to be established in the Poruk Empire. The Poruk had permitted it to be set up in their largest city, Ulra. In reality, it would probably be the only embassy for a long time. He recalled being briefed that intense negotiations had taken place between UHA and the Poruk Empire. The negotiations had lasted several weeks. Richards found the negotiation process a waste of time, all for just one UHA embassy on Capital One. He could understand if the negotiations involved a myriad of embassies being set up across multiple Poruk planets. That would have justified the lengthy negotiation process. The strange thing was that in return the Poruk Empire hadn't requested for an embassy on Beta 1. UHA had offered the Porukian negotiators to set up their own embassy, but they had been disinterested by it. Richards turned to the soldier manning the post. "Report." "All clear, sir," the young soldier replied. The soldier couldn't have been more than 20 years old. He reminded Richards of his early days in UHA. Those days had been at the start of the Pinnacle War. His unit had been one of the first deployed on a UHA destroyer. However, they had come under attack from the Poruk around Beta 6. It had been an ambush that the captain of the destroyer hadn't been able to overcome. Eventually, Richards had been forced to evacuate the destroyer, losing most of his unit. Although he had gone on subsequent missions, the loss of many young men and women from his first unit had continued to haunt him all these years. When he had been posted to protect the UHA embassy on Ulra, Richards had been confused. Surely there were other captains and units that could protect the embassy. He felt his capabilities were underutilized in Ulra. The Pinnacle War was over. He doubted Capital One would ever face an attack. Even if they did, the attackers would focus on the Poruk governmental compounds and not a solitary UHA embassy. Richards flicked his eyes across the compound housing the UHA embassy. It was nothing impressive. That had been intentional. The UHA didn't want to attract any attention on Ulra. Despite the war being over, Richards was well aware that the feelings against humanity wouldn't vanish overnight. Many individuals on both sides had suffered terrible losses. "What's the ETA for her arrival?" Richards asked. 5 minutes, sir." Richards could describe every day at the embassy with a single line. That was how routine it had become. However, today was going to be different. Poruk Vice-Chancellor Trez was making an unofficial visit to the embassy. He had been informed of it late last night. Richards had thought nothing of it. Porukian officials typically made a visit every month. However, the Vice-Chancellor was the highest-ranking Porukian to make the visit. Richards had decided to personally stand outside and await the Vice-Chancellor's arrival. He wasn't taking any chances. The road was emptier at this hour. It mostly had to do with the fact that this district housed more governmental officers than anything else. It was rare to see common Porukians ambling about. The district also had gantries that kept curious onlookers away. That itself made guarding the embassy much easier. Despite that, Richards refused to be complacent. He spoke through the comms to Lieutenant Lombardi. "Lieutenant, report." "Everyone is at their positions," Lombardi replied. "Copy that," Richards said and closed the comms. Then his gaze fixed on an individual on the other side of the road. He hadn't noticed the individual before. The individual was wearing a robe and walking slowly by, a bit too slow for Richards' liking. "Soldier, we have a potential hostile on the other side of the road," Richards barked. "Get someone to check him out." "Yes, sir," the soldier replied and began speaking to someone on his comms. It was probably nothing, but then again it didn't harm to check. Ever since the attack by an unknown enemy on humanity and the Poruk Empire, the alert levels had been increased. He was aware more patrols were being deployed, especially around Capital One. While none of the attacks had been near Capital One, the Poruk Empire had begun solidifying their orbital defenses. That was a point of concern for Richards. The Poruk Empire was showing the initial signs of fear. Another soldier emerged from within the gates to the embassy and began crossing the road. Richards checked the time. The Vice-Chancellor should be arriving any second. Then everything went to hell. Chapter 2, UHA Embassy Capital 1. The robed individual threw away the robe. Richards realized it wasn't a Porukian. It was another alien species. Before he could say anything, the alien aimed his rifle-like weapon and unleashed a burst of weapons fire at his soldier. His man had no time to react and collapsed onto the ground. Richards pulled out his weapon, took cover behind the gates and returned fire. The soldier at the gate was beside him, targeting the alien. Another burst of weapons fire emerged from the right side. Richards turned his gaze in that direction. A second alien had appeared. Who were they? Where had they come from? The Poruk Empire didn't allow other species to roam in their space. They had a strict policy on it. As far as Richards knew, he, his unit, and those in the embassy were the only non-Porukians on Capital One. "We need backup out here," Richards shouted through the comms. Richards aimed his weapon and fired in the direction of the second alien. Then he heard the sound of an engine. It was the Vice-Chancellor's transport. Obviously, the driver hadn't noticed the firefight in front of the embassy. Richards tried to wave to the driver of the Vice-Chancellor's transport. The driver must have noticed as the transport came to an abrupt halt. An explosion occurred behind the transport. Richards' eyes widened. The attackers had blocked the Vice-Chancellor's transport from reversing down the road. There was only one place the transport could find refuge in. "Open the gates now," Richard barked. He turned around only to find that the soldier beside him was dead. Richards went to the side of the gate and pressed on the emergency override panel. The gate began to slowly slide open. Richards waved to the driver while continuing to exchange weapons fire with the two aliens. Lieutenant Lombardi and two more men arrived and began firing at the two aliens. Their appearance forced the aliens to fall back. The Vice-Chancellor's transport lurched forward as the driver turned into the UHA embassy compound. Richards was sweating as the transport went past him. "Shut the gates," Richard ordered. Lombardi rolled over to the side and pressed on the panel. The gates began to slowly close. Another explosion ripped across the center of the road. Then the weapons fire stopped. Richards flicked his eyes up and down the road. Other than the fire from the explosion, it was empty. "Captain, where did they go?" Lombardi asked. Richards blinked his eyes. "I don't know. Did anyone see them running away?" All of his men shook their heads. Richards suppressed a sigh. Something wasn't right. The aliens couldn't have just disappeared into thin air. They had to be lurking around. "Lieutenant, check on the Vice-Chancellor," Richards ordered. "The rest of you stand guard at the gates." As he was about to turn around, a sound emerged from behind him. Richards swirled around. A figure in a blue spacesuit with a visor over his head was standing beside the Vice-Chancellor's transport. The door to the transport was open. Richard aimed his weapon at the figure, but before he could do anything, the figure began to get smaller. Then the figure vanished. Richards rushed over to the transport and looked inside the door. The back of the transport was empty. Richards opened the driver's door. The driver's body slumped to the ground. "Can anyone get me a position of the Poruk Vice-Chancellor?" Richards shouted. There was silence over his comms. Richards swallowed hard. The Poruk Vice-Chancellor had disappeared. Chapter 3, Unknown Planet Neutral Zone. Siobhan peered from behind the boulder. The faint light appeared from around the hill. Lile was on her way back to the portal to find out what had happened to her antimatter charge. Siobhan didn't need to guess that Lile had to be fuming. She was marching forward at a rapid pace. Once Lile reached the portal, she knelt and began combing the vicinity for her device. Then Lile stood and glanced around. "Do you think you are so smart moving an antimatter charge?" Siobhan clutched her weapon and remained hidden behind the boulder. "It's dangerous to move such a device after it has been activated," Lile shouted. "I'll give you one last chance to return it to me." "I know you have it, Siobhan." Siobhan's blood ran cold. How did Lile know it was her? Had she left some evidence behind at the portal? Siobhan was irritated with herself. She must have dropped something to tip Lile off. If not, it was impossible for Lile to figure it out. Lily raised her voice. Siobhan, don't be stupid. You're going to die on this planet. Let me help you. I can explain why I put the device near the portal. It isn't what you think. Siobhan didn't believe a word the female aboax was spewing from her mouth. It was all lies. Lily's intentions had been clear: to destroy the portal and trap Captain Gibson and Serli in the other dimension. No explanation could change that fact. I warned you, Lily barked, exasperation dripping from her voice. This is all your fault. Then an explosion ripped from a hill towards her right. The ground shook. Siobhan pressed her body against the boulder as the shaking continued for a few more seconds. She dared not look behind her. When the antimatter device had been initially activated at the portal, Siobhan had run like never before in the direction of a hill several hundred meters behind her current position. As she had raced towards the hill, she had been conscious of the fact that the device might explode in her hands. But it hadn't. Sweat had been dripping over her face when she had reached the hill. Fortunately, upon reaching the hill, she discovered a cave. Without waiting, she had darted into the cave and gone as deep as she could go before depositing the antimatter device on the ground. The red activation indicator hadn't changed. Then Siobhan turned and ran for her life out of the cave and away from the hill. Her mind had been racing with thoughts that the device would explode at any moment. However, that hadn't happened. By the time she had taken refuge behind the boulders, she had been out of breath. She had sat down and tried to gather herself. She wasn't in shape as she should have been. She made a mental note to herself to get in shape once all this was over. Despite that, Siobhan had been relieved she had gotten the antimatter device as far away as possible from the portal. Siobhan waited for Lily's next move. The female aboax would most likely head in the direction of the hill. Siobhan didn't hear anything. She slowly peered out from the boulder. Lily wasn't at the portal. She was gone. Where had the female aboax disappeared to? Siobhan didn't like it. She doubted Lily would have given up and withdrawn back to the Vecro. That option didn't seem to fit into Lily's style. Then weapons fire roared past her head. Siobhan sighed. Lily had found her position. Chapter 4: Unknown Planet Neutral Zone. Siobhan leaned against the boulder. Her heart was pounding. She glanced to the left and to the right. She couldn't stay here any longer. Lily would circle around and catch her. It was only a matter of time. Siobhan didn't want to think of what Lily might do to her if she was captured. She slowly got to her feet, pulled out a grenade from her holster, and threw it in front of the boulder. "What are you doing?" Lily screamed. An explosion ripped through the air. Siobhan jumped and ran to the left. The smoke from the explosion covered her retreat. Once she reached another set of boulders, Siobhan peered from beside it. The smoke from the explosion slowly began to clear. She couldn't see any sign of the female aboax. However, Siobhan was certain of one thing: Lily wasn't dead. The female aboax was too experienced to fall into her trap. "Did you think a simple grenade could kill me?" Lily demanded. The sound of Lily's voice was faint. The female aboax must have been forced to fall back when the grenade hit the ground. That was a good start. Siobhan needed to keep as much distance as possible from Lily. "I was going to simply restrain you," Lily sneered. "But after the grenade, I'm just going to kill you. You're a disgrace to that uniform. Do you know that? You cannot even hide from me." Siobhan swallowed hard. She refused to let Lily's words find a refuge in her mind. That was what Lily wanted, to force Siobhan to make a mistake. "You're not fit to be a commander in the UHA," Lily continued. "A real UHA commander would have come out from behind wherever you are hiding and fought with me." Lily was trying to lure her out, but Siobhan had no interest in playing that game. However, she didn't know how long she could last out here with the experienced female aboax. "Do you know how many people I've killed?" Lily asked. Siobhan kept glancing around for a way to move to the next set of boulders. Fortunately, there was a series of boulders along her right side. She slowly got on her knees and began crawling in that direction. "You are being a coward. A UHA commander doesn't crawl on her knees." Siobhan dismissed those thoughts. Siobhan, do you know that I cannot even remember how many individuals are killed? Lily repeated. That's how big the number really is. Why don't you just give yourself up? Then we can end this. Who knows? Maybe I'll change my mind and let you live. You could partner with me. You don't have to work for Gibson any longer. Gibson won't survive the portal. Lily's boasting had no end. It was sickening. Siobhan couldn't understand how Captain Gibson had tolerated the female Aboaks in the past. Siobhan kept crawling. Lily's voice became softer. Siobhan, can you hear me? Lily screamed. I'm going to give you one last chance to save yourself. You don't have to work for Gibson anymore. I'm giving you the opportunity of a lifetime. Work with me. Lily must have thought that Siobhan was naive. Who would believe anything the female Aboaks was saying? Siobhan pushed aside any thoughts of Lily. A momentary loss in concentration could end up getting herself killed. I gave you a warning, Lily said. Her voice sounded louder. Siobhan realized the female Aboaks was closing in on her. Siobhan began to crawl faster. She stopped as she heard a sound. Then an explosion ripped behind her. Siobhan looked back. It had been the first few boulders where she had taken refuge. Nothing of them was left. Lily had lost all patience with her. Siobhan kept moving as another sound was heard, another explosion. The debris from the boulder fell around her. Then there was a third sound. Siobhan felt her body thrown a distance away from the explosion. Everything blacked out. Chapter 5, Unknown Planets, Other Dimension. Gibson opened his eyes. The blue sky encircled his vision. Why was he staring at the sky? It was only then that he realized he was on his back. He blinked his eyes and tried to lift his head. A pain shot up the back of his head. I wouldn't do that, a voice whispered. Gibson turned his head in the direction of the voice. It was Serli. She was seated beside him with her helmet open. Where are we? Gibson asked. He tried to recollect the last thing he could remember. All he recalled was being under attack by the armored hovercraft along the sand dunes. He winced as he tried to get up. I told you not to get up, Serli warned. Your body was flung quite a distance from the last explosion. I'm surprised you were still alive. I thought you had died. Would that have made you happy? Gibson growled as he lay back down. Have you also gone mad? Serli countered. Why would I want you dead? Gibson shrugged as he opened his helmet. I managed to disable those hovercraft and drag you away from there, Serli highlighted. You were heavier than I expected. Gibson couldn't believe Serli had been able to destroy both hovercrafts. Was the Poruk Captain working together with whoever was here in this dimension? His thoughts raced to the possibility that this was an elaborate trap. Where are we again? Gibson asked. We're at the edge of a forest, Serli replied. The one we saw from the portal entrance? Gibson asked. Serli shook her head. Not that one. While I was dragging you away, I discovered another forest. This is a strange place. Gibson again tried to get up. This time he was successful, although the pain refused to give him the victory. He looked ahead of him. It was a dense forest. He glanced backwards. The sand dunes smiled back. How long was I out? Gibson asked. A few hours. A few hours? How far had Serli dragged him? He couldn't estimate where they were, but he suspected it had been a significant distance. Did she know the way back to the portal entrance? Serli must have read his mind. I had to put a lot of distance between us and the hovercrafts. I wasn't sure if there were more of them waiting for us. It was too risky to stay in that area. Appreciate you bringing me here, Gibson said. Serli nodded. You should rest a bit longer. Here's some food. She passed him a small ration pack. Gibson took the pack, opened it and swallowed the contents. You didn't even ask me what was in the pack, Serli remarked. It could have been a poison. Gibson smiled. If you wanted to kill me, I don't think you would have dragged me all the way here to poison me. Captain, Serli began. Gibson raised his hand. I'm no longer a captain of anything. Even so, I know it's difficult to work with me, Serli said. We are both captains from a war that saw so much loss and suffering. I'll admit that it's not easy to trust humans. But in this new dimension, we need to work together to find out where those humans are being held and what the Prionen are up to. Serli was trying to reach out to him. He admired her for that. He wished he could say he would have been able to do the same. However, the after effects of a war lingered longer than necessary and shaped every thought. He still didn't trust the Poruk Captain, but was willing to continue working together. And the truth was that she had saved him from the hovercraft. I understand, Gibson said as he staggered to his feet. How far is the portal from here? Serli stared ahead. I'll need to retrace my steps. Gibson struggled with her response. It was simply another way of saying she didn't know. If Serli didn't know the way back to the portal, they were in serious trouble. He pushed that thought aside for now. They would have to face that issue when the time arose. But that time wasn't now. Have you explored the forest? Gibson inquired. Serli stood beside him. I was waiting for you to recover. Are you sure you are ready? Ready as ever, Gibson said. Chapter 6, Unknown Planet, Other Dimension. Serli eyed the trees in front of them. Ever since she had brought Gibson to the edge of the forest, she had been tempted to go and explore it on her own. However, it was dangerous for them to split up, not in this unknown dimension. Gibson's health had also kept her from exploring the forest. But now that the UHA captain had recovered, faster than expected, it was time to find out more about this dimension. She had also decided to be open about working together. However, she couldn't let herself reveal anything else, including the details of the galactic weapon. While Vice Chancellor Trez had betrayed her with the insertion of the memories, Serli didn't want to take revenge. Despite that, Trez's betrayal continued to test her emotions. Serli pulled out her weapon. I'll go first. Gibson didn't argue with her. Instead, he began to follow her as she stepped into the forest. As they marched forward, the light from the sky began to diminish. Serli realized that she had never seen trees so thick and so green. They were tall, with lots of branches protruding in every direction. I wouldn't touch them, Gibson warned. Serli agreed. They didn't know much about this dimension and what dangers lurked around. It was better to be as cautious as possible. Did you hear that? Gibson said. Serli stopped. She hadn't heard anything. She glanced back at him before turning around. As she was about to take another step, she heard it, a rustling sound. She looked up at the tree she was standing under. She clutched her weapon and then trained it above her. Gibson walked to her and pointed ahead. Serli gazed in the direction of his hand. A small creature was swinging from one of the trees ahead of them. What is it? Serli whispered. Maybe a bird of some kind? It could be the first living thing they had encountered in this dimension. Serli was certain it wouldn't be the last. The bird was on the move. Then she pulled out her weapon and fired it. The sound was brief, but her aim was perfect. Gibson didn't seem pleased with her action. What are you doing? It was only a bird. There was no need to kill it. I want to find out more about it, Serli replied as she began to walk towards the area where the bird had fallen to the ground. Gibson was beside her as she reached the vicinity where the bird had supposedly fallen. She knelt on the ground and then gasped. It isn't a bird, Gibson commented. At a distance, Serli had grasped that the bird was a living thing, but staring at it now, she realized the bird wasn't a living thing. It looks like a flying bot, Serli mused. The flying bot had been designed to mimic a bird. It was sleek. There were electrical wires jutting out of the bot. Serli poked it with her weapon. A few fumes emerged from it. Is the bot disabled? Gibson asked. I presume so. Serli continued to poke it, but there was no reaction. The bot was no longer functioning. Where did this bot come from? And what was its purpose? Whoever had created it knew well enough the features of a bird. The intention had been to blend in with the forest. Serli stood and glanced around the dense forest. It was a patrol bot. Are you certain? It's the only thing that I can think of. This flying patrol bot was monitoring this part of the forest. Gibson acknowledged her. She could assume he knew the dangers. Whoever had sent the flying bot was out there, possibly further down in the forest. They would need to tread forward carefully. Chapter 7, Unknown Planet, Other Dimension. Gibson couldn't ascertain how long they had been trudging through the forest. For an instant, he had the thought that this forest would never end. Just as he had dismissed the thought, a clearing began to form ahead of them. Gibson picked up his pace before Serli grabbed him by the shoulder. He realized his mistake and slowed down. The moment they stepped out of the forest, they would be completely exposed. Whoever had built the flying patrol boat was out there. Had the patrol boat been able to send its creators surveillance on them? Gibson frowned. They were dealing with an unknown technology in a different dimension. All the old assumptions of other species in their own dimension were no longer valid. Gibson had to throw them out and start from the beginning. It was going to be harder than he thought. As they approached the last line of trees before the clearing, Gibson crouched down. Serli was beside him. He flicked his eyes to the left and the right. The clearing was bare ground with several rock formations scattered around. Nothing of significance could be observed, not from this vantage point. Beyond the rock formations there was a large hill. There was no way to ascertain what was beyond that hill. Those rocks could be hiding our enemies, Serli whispered. For a moment Gibson nearly chuckled. Serli, his old enemy, was talking about their new enemies. He still hadn't got used to working with the Poruk Captain. Initially he had been dead set against working with Serli, but slowly Gibson realized his defenses were coming down, one by one. He didn't want to let his guard down, but he had to credit the Porukian with saving his life. Serli could have easily left him to die at the hands of those hovercraft, and no one would ever know what happened to him or even come looking for him. Gibson nodded. We cannot stay in the forest forever. Serli pointed to the left. We can try to get to those rocks. They are the closest to the tree line. Gibson grunted and they began walking parallel to the tree line towards the left. After a dozen or more steps, they stopped. This was as close as they were going to get to the rocks. Gibson glanced around. Nothing, no movement of any kind. This dimension was a strange one. Everything's too quiet, Gibson whispered. A natural forest should have the sounds of life, but there's nothing here. The species who created the patrol boat is out there, Serli said. She didn't want to remind him of it. Despite that, so far they hadn't seen a single living thing, which was unusual. Gibson returned his gaze to the nearest rocks. We need to make a run for it. Serli frowned. What is it? Gibson asked. I don't know. What are your thoracic senses saying? Serli's mouth hung open. How? Gibson suppressed a grin. He knew the Poruk had a way to sense any impending danger. The first time he encountered it was during a firefight on a Poruk-friendly planet during the Pinnacle War. A Porukian spy who had been helping them had shared about the thoracic sensors. At that time, Gibson had been shocked to learn about the sensors, but he had learned to leverage upon it. I discovered it during the war, Gibson said. Serli seemed to accept his response. He wasn't going to share with the Poruk Captain about the Porukian spy. He didn't know how she would react if she discovered that he had worked with Porukian spies. It's time we get to those rocks, Serli announced. Gibson agreed. They needed to make a move. Staying in the forest too long wasn't an option. He also needed to get back to Chevron soon. The commander would be worried for them. On my mark, Gibson said. He did a slow countdown and they both rushed out of the forest and bolted towards the rocks. Halfway to the rocks, a whirring sound emerged. Gibson didn't stop but kept running. By the time they reached the rocks, he was panting. He turned around and discovered Serli wasn't with him. She stood still several meters away from him. Serli didn't make any moves as a group of flying patrol bots encircled her. Chapter 8, Unknown Planet, Other Dimension. Gibson was about to fire on the patrol bots when a voice boomed from above him. Put your weapon down, human. Gibson froze and peered into the sky. Above him was a small shuttle-like sleek vessel. He was able to see the human alien pilot with narrow eye slits staring back at him. Gibson dropped his weapon and raised his hands. On your knees, the voice hissed. Gibson complied. A quick glance behind him and he observed that Serli was also on her knees. The dust swirled as the vessel landed in front of him. Gibson grimaced. They had made a mistake. They should have waited until nightfall to mount a run. The patrol bot they had destroyed earlier must have been able to alert its creators. The vessel's hatch opened, and the humanoid alien sauntered down the ramp. Based on the way Siobhan and Serli had described the Prionen species, this wasn't one of them. It was another alien species, probably unique to this dimension. The alien was tall with a long, thin neck and pale blue skin. It had in its hands a short weapon and wore a silver suit. There was nothing on its suit to identify its origins. The alien walked up to him. "Stand up slowly." Gibson obeyed. "Who are you?" A weapon's fire hit right in front of his feet. Gibson stood his ground. "I didn't ask you to speak," the alien barked. "I'll tell you when you can speak. Only then can you do so." The alien gestured to Serli, who stood, and walked over to where Gibson was standing. The flying patrol bot slowly moved with her, and now they were both surrounded by them. "Welcome, human and Porukian," the alien announced. "Although it isn't really a welcome. You are our prisoners. I will take you to Sias, where you will be imprisoned for trespassing in our dimension and planet." Gibson remained silent. "You have permission to speak now," the alien scoffed. "We were not trespassing," Gibson commented. "We walked through a portal and entered this planet." "We know where you came from, human," the alien sneered. "You shouldn't have come to our dimension. That portal is only for registered beings. You weren't registered to enter through it." The alien's argument was nonsensical. There was nobody there to guard the portal. In theory, anyone could walk through it. "Where are the Prionen species?" Gibson asked. The alien took a step towards Gibson and slapped his face hard. The force of the slap nearly took the wind out of Gibson. His legs nearly buckled, but he managed to remain standing. "You do not address our masters with such disrespect," the alien snorted. "Do you understand me?" Gibson nodded. He was still trying to recover from the slap. Despite that, the alien's response had told him enough. These aliens were the slaves of the Prionen, like the Toaxi species. Apparently, the Prionen species seemed to enslave many other species. Gibson wondered if that was how the Prionen species functioned. "It's time you were taken to see us," the alien admitted. Then two long pods flew down the ramp and stood in front of Gibson and Serli. One was black in color while the other was red. The top of each pod opened to reveal a large enough space for a single individual. The alien pointed to him. "Human, step inside the red pod now. For a prisoner, you should find it more than comfortable." Gibson shot a look at Serli, who shrugged. He had hoped the Poruk Captain would have had a plan to get them out of this, but it was obvious she didn't. He then stepped into the red pod and laid himself down. It was the strangest way yet to be restrained. The pod seemed to adjust to his size once he was inside of it, leaving a minimal amount of space around his body. Then the top slowly closed in on him. It was only then that he realized there was a small glass panel at his eye level. Once the top closed, Gibson thought he would suffocate inside of it, but he felt calm. There was sufficient air inside the pod. He began to feel the pod move. A few seconds later, the pod tilted itself. He was going up the ramp and into the vessel. The pod came to a stop. Gibson tried to peer through the glass panel. All he could see was a wall. Then Gibson felt the pod begin to vibrate. It had to be the alien vessel taking off. Sias must be an alien city. Again, Gibson frowned. Before entering the portal, they hadn't witnessed any images of a city. It didn't matter. Eventually he would find out more. Chapter 9. Sias' Other Dimension. Gibson opened his eyes. He didn't know how long he had been out. He also couldn't recall when he had fallen asleep. The last thing he remembered was the vibration of the alien vessel. Something must have been injected into his pod. The top cover of the pod was opened. He got up, stepped out of the pod and found himself in a square chamber with a door at one end. Gibson checked his body. His suit and weapons had been removed. He didn't know when that had happened. It must have been in the transit to this chamber. Without a suit, he didn't know how they were going to get back to their dimension. Gibson walked towards the solid metal door. He clicked on the panel beside him. Surprisingly, the door slid open. "He's awake," a soft voice announced. Gibson found himself standing in front of a child. A human female child? She could have been no more than 5 years of age. The young girl smiled at him and then ran away. Gibson peered around. He was standing at the edge of a large chamber with high ceilings. Around the chamber there were several corridors. On the other end there were several humans. An older man in faded overalls walked up to him and extended his hand. "Welcome to see us. My name is Charlie." Gibson was confused as he shook hands with Charlie. "Do you have a name?" Charlie asked. "Gibson." Gibson replied softly. "Where am I?" "Sias," Charlie smiled. "What is Sias?" Gibson asked. "The factory city," Charlie replied. "We are the workers in this factory." "But you are human. Why are you here in this dimension?" Charlie narrowed his eyes. "You're confused. It's typical of any new arrival. We didn't expect a single arrival today. Normally we get a group of humans who arrive together. You are the first human who arrived alone." "Arrived?" Gibson said. "From where?" "From our dimension, of course," Charlie remarked. "I doubt you would remember anything. None of us did when it happened to us. You were brought here by the Prionen species through their interdimensional transport. This dimension is referred to as A45. It dawned on Gibson what Charlie was talking about. These were humans who had been abducted by the Prionen species. And they seemed to know a lot about the Prionen species. Or at least Charlie was aware. "When did you arrive in Sias?" Gibson asked. 7 years ago, Charlie replied. Gibson's eyes widened. "I know it sounds like a long time," Charlie murmured, "but we are their workers. We don't have a choice but to do the work they command us to do." Charlie spoke about their imprisonment in a calm manner, as if it was the most normal thing to do. Gibson found it unnerving. "What work is that?" Gibson asked as the young girl ran up to Charlie and grabbed his leg. Charlie looked at the young girl. "Cleo, did you introduce yourself to Mr. Gibson?" Cleo shook her head shyly. "This is Cleo," Charlie admitted, "one of the youngest of us." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Gibson," Cleo said. Gibson smiled at the young girl, after which she ran off again. "Do you mean to say you're forced to work here?" Gibson asked. Charlie nodded. "Force is rather a strong word, but that's the truth. We willingly do the work. It's the only thing we can do at Sias." Gibson sensed Charlie was holding back a lot of information. "What do the Prionen species force you to work on?" "Weapons." "I don't understand how you can work on them." "I see your confusion," Charlie said. "Sias is like a weapons factory. We work in the assembly line for their weapons. We don't need to have training to handle the weapons, only to assemble them. A few of us have some training, but they are used for higher value purposes." "How many humans are here in this factory?" Gibson asked. Then a klaxon wailed throughout the chamber. Charlie's smiling facial expression was replaced by that of worry. "It's time for the head count. Check. Follow me and don't say a word." Chapter 10, Sias, A45 Dimension. Gibson didn't have to wait long for the answer to his question. He tried his best to keep up with Charlie as the older man raced across the chamber to the other end. As they walked closer, Gibson was astonished by what he witnessed. Rows of humans were standing quietly. They were mainly men and women with a few teenagers. He spotted Cleo in the midst. She must have been the only child here. None of them looked in his direction. Most of their faces were worn out. Gibson estimated that the numbers were in the hundreds. He couldn't believe his eyes as Charlie motioned for him to stand at one corner of the second row. Gibson assumed his position and waited. The klaxon continued to wail, although at a softer level. A deep voice spoke from above him. "Humans, you know the drill. Do not move while we do the head count check. Any movement will suffer a consequence. A whirring sound emerged. Gibson stared ahead. 3 black circular bots began flying towards them. They were similar in size to the patrol bots he and Serli had encountered outside the forest. Gibson realized he had completely forgotten about the Poruk Captain. He made a mental note to ask Charlie about her. This chamber seemed to only be occupied by humans. Serli had to be in another chamber. The 3 bots stopped in front of the first row of humans. Then 3 red beams streaked forward, sweeping the rows. Gibson suspected they were doing an automated roll call. He had hoped to see a few of the aliens, but none of them appeared. His eyes darted around. Everyone in his row was standing still. No one was fidgeting. A few minutes later, the bots turned around and left the chamber. The klaxon went silent. The deep voice spoke again. Head count check has been completed. Resume your duties. The rows and rows of humans began promptly dispersing. No chatter could be heard. In a matter of seconds, the chamber had been nearly emptied out. Charlie walked up to him. They require a head count check every day. It's part of the protocol. Who are they? Gibson asked. My apologies, but I forgot to mention them to you, Charlie said. They are the Flittera species. They run everything in Sias, including this weapons factory. Where do these Flittera come from? No one knows. When we were brought here, the Flittera introduced themselves as those in charge of us. We follow their orders. I assume that means the Flittera species take their orders from the Prionen. That's what we also presume. However, I personally have never met anyone from the Prionen species. It seems like a complicated system, but everything is done in an orderly manner. Gibson continued to be deeply troubled by the manner in which Charlie spoke about Sias. He didn't seem at all fazed by their situation. How could humans have opted to give up and live in this prison? They seemed to have accepted Sias as their fate. Gibson then shared how he happened to reach this place. Charlie's face darkened. Wait a second. You mean the Prionen didn't snatch you from our dimension and bring you here? No, I came here with a Porukian. The anxiety had returned to Charlie's face. I thought the Porukians were our enemies. The war has been over for a year, Gibson reported. We are at peace and now work together in our dimension. Charlie whistled. I never would have imagined the day that humanity would be working hand in hand with the Porukians. Then a hand touched his shoulder. Gibson turned around and froze. A woman was standing smiling at him. He would have recognized her anywhere. It was his wife, Leanne. Chapter 11, Sias, Other Dimension. Serli stood at the door. She didn't like that her suit was gone. All she had on was a Porukian uniform which would easily identify her in this dimension. That was the last thing she desired. She suspected something inside the restraint pod had dissolved away her suit, although she hadn't sensed it until she stepped out of the pod. The fact that Gibson wasn't here didn't surprise her. The aliens must have done it intentionally. It would explain the need for the different color restraint pods. She had been standing at the closed door for a few minutes. Without a weapon, she felt vulnerable. Despite that, she didn't have a choice but to open the door and discover what was waiting for her outside. One thing was certain. The journey to Sias had been a short one. That implied they weren't too far from the forest and the portal. Once a restraint pod had moved into the cargo bay of the alien vessel, a chemical had been injected into the pod. However, the Porukian body had been able to fend it off. It was one of the many ways the Poruk Empire had been able to enhance the Porukian body, especially for those serving. She suspected the chemical's purpose had been to put her to sleep. Fortunately, that had failed. However, she had kept her eyes closed in case the alien had done a visual inspection through the glass panel. Gibson must have fallen asleep. As far as she knew, the human body was quite susceptible to such chemicals. Once the vessel had lifted off, Serli had opened her eyes and been alert to the movements of the vessel. She had been able to gauge the distance and movements of the vessel. Then the vessel had come to a stop and Serli had felt the pod descending down a ramp. She hadn't heard any voices. Eventually the restraint pod had stopped moving. She had pretended to be asleep during the pod's movement. The moment the top of the pod lifted up, she opened her eyes and found herself in this chamber. Serli frowned. It was now or never. She clicked on the panel beside the door. The door slid open to reveal a large chamber with high ceilings. Initially, she thought the chamber was empty, but then she began to see figures at the other end of the chamber. She narrowed her eyes. It couldn't be. Was her eyes playing tricks on her? She rubbed her eyes again. She slowly walked towards the figures. It was impossible. What were they doing here? She kept walking until the figures became clearer. Her suspicions had been correct. The figures were Porukians. Then, one of the figures walked up to her. Serli gasped. How? How? Serli's voice trailed off. The figure was equally shocked to meet her. I know, Captain Serli. Apato smiled. I couldn't believe it myself when I first set my eyes on you. This is not possible, Serli said. I destroyed the farm and the weapons factory with all of you in it. And yet I'm standing in front of you, Apato commented. I know it's hard to believe. For me, seeing you here of all places is also an impossibility. I'm still trying to understand it. Serli didn't feel anything from her thoracic sensors. There was nothing insidious with Apato standing in front of her. It wasn't a hallucination. She was actually standing in front of the Porukian that she had supposedly killed many years ago on PR-45. Apato gestured to the right side of the chamber. Serli followed him and sat down at an empty table. He sat opposite her and looked at her. How did you get here? Serli asked. Before showing up here, the last thing I remember was the alarms ringing as your missiles edged ever closer to the farm and the weapons factory. All the workers became frantic, but we knew there was nothing we could do. This was an eventuality that we had been prepared for, but we never thought it would actually come. If you had to initiate the destruction of the weapons factory on PR-45, we figured it had to be because of the humans. Serli suppressed a sigh. One of her darkest periods of the Pinnacle War had decided to revisit her at the most unexpected of times. She refused to allow her emotions to come to the surface. For so long, she had successfully kept this dark period hidden. She had walked with this hidden shame for years and suppressed it well. No one had ever spoken about the incident at PR-45. It had become another incident with a lot of mass casualties, easily forgotten through the passage of time. We all gathered together at the weapons factory, held hands and waited for the end, Apato continued. Then we found ourselves here. We don't know how we got here. One moment we were in the weapons factory, the next moment we were in this chamber. You mean you appeared in this chamber? Serli asked. Serli found that hard to believe. The Porukians must have been transported to this chamber, just like she had been forced to get into the restraint pod. Apato nodded. Not only me, but every one of us who had been in that weapons factory. Every one of us? Serli was stunned by his admission. She was unable to recall how many workers had been deployed on PR-45, but the number wasn't small. To efficiently run one weapons factory in the galactic weapons supply chain took a few hundred workers. What happened after you appeared here? Serli asked. For years, Serli had struggled with the fact that she had ordered all these Porukians to their death. She had only been following Imperial Command protocols and obeying the Poruk Code. And she had been forced to execute the protocols because of the humans and their persistence. That was how she reasoned with herself. It was the only way forward. However, now she was faced with the fact that the Prionen species had intervened and transported all of the Porukians away before the weapons factory had been destroyed. Initially, we were lost until we encountered the Flitera species. Serli looked puzzled. Flitera? They are the species that dominate this part of the planet, Apato replied. They controlled us and put us to work. A few of us tried to fight, but the Flitera killed them publicly. It was horrifying. After that, no one tried to stand up to the Flitera. Then Serli understood the implication of Apato's words. She had missed it when he had spoken a few seconds ago. You mentioned every one of us was brought here. Apato nodded. After the Flitera took dominion over us, we did a check. None of us was left to die on PR-45. It was quite incredible. We had been ready to die on that planet. It was like we were given a second chance, Captain Serli. I don't know how else to say it. Serli ignored his words as her mind drifted to the possibility. Is a little female Porukian child also here? Her name is Arya. Chapter 12, Sia's Other Dimension. The recognition that swept Apato's face didn't go unnoticed by Serli. It was quickly replaced by fear. Apato looked puzzled. How do you know about her? Serli pulled out the encased purple flower. Apato's eyes brightened at the sight of it. She twirled it in her fingers. The last time I visited PR-45, Arya gave me this. Apato tried to reach for it but then stopped himself. She always loved the purple flower. Serli's heart began to pound. The way Apato had referred to the young Porukian child scared her. Is she alive? Serli asked, not realizing until it was too late that she was whispering. Apato beamed. I did say every one of us was transported here. Of course Arya's alive. However, Captain Serli, there's something I need to tell you. Serli looked at him as if he was about to reveal some horrific news. Arya's my daughter, Apato admitted. The fear in his voice had no place to hide. Serli knew it was forbidden for Apato to mix with the workers. That was one of the primary non-negotiable protocols under the Poruk Code for the Porukian in charge of a weapons factory. Serli was reminded of the principle, adherence to protocol above all else. Apato had broken it, and done it right in front of her eyes. During her regular visits to PR-45, Apato had managed to keep the child and her mother a secret. Despite that, they were no longer under Imperial command, and the weapons factory didn't exist, at least not in this dimension. Apato looked at the ground. I know I broke the Poruk Code. I understand, Serli said carefully. Since you're all supposed to be dead and the weapons factory is no longer functioning, you're technically not under the Poruk Code. She didn't want to belittle the Poruk Code. Those principles underlying the Poruk Code govern every walk of Poruk society. Nor did she want Apato to live with the guilt accustomed to breaking the Poruk Code. It was commonly known that Porukians who broke the code suffered a lot during the rest of their lives. However, this was an unprecedented scenario. Captain Serli, you aren't going to arrest me, Apato asked, mystified. Breaking the Poruk Code is treason? I'm not here in my capacity as a Poruk Captain. That was a lie, but Serli didn't want to make Apato any more anxious than he already was. The fact that he and the rest were alive was something she was still processing. Serli tried her best to remain calm. Every part of her inner being wanted to see Arya. Serli couldn't understand the feeling. It was something she had never before encountered, but she had to control herself. It was too dangerous to let all those feelings run rampant. Not here, not now. I don't understand, Apato said. I didn't come to this dimension to find you, Serli commented. Dimension? What dimension are you talking about? It became apparent to Serli that the Porukians didn't know they had been taken out of their dimension. Serli tried to hide her disappointment with the Porukians. They should have tried to figure out where they were rather than accepting their fate. It was shocking to her that after all these years the Porukians had never chosen to explore or question their existence in Sias. Instead, they merely followed the orders. Their masters and Imperial command had been replaced by those of the Flitera species. You are in another dimension, Serli explained. I came to this place through a portal on a planet in the neutral zone. Apato's eyes widened. Serli had enough of talking with the Porukian. Where's Arya? Take me to her. Yes, Captain Serli, Apato said. He turned and Serli followed him towards a corridor on the left side of the chamber. A tinge of excitement fluttered through her body. That was an unusual feeling for her. As they strode down the corridor, Serli began to imagine how Arya would look after so many years. Arya would no longer be the small child Serli had been impacted by on PR-45. Would she even remember Serli? Most likely not. It had been one brief encounter when Arya had been so young. Apato stopped at a door and pressed on a panel. The door slid open and Serli stepped in behind Apato. Arya, there's someone here to see you, Apato said. Arya stepped out of the shadows. Serli froze. It was impossible. Arya looked the same as she had so many years ago on PR-45. She hadn't aged at all. Chapter 13, Sia's Other Dimension. Serli's body stiffened. Something had to be wrong here. Was this a trick of the Prionen species? Was Apato working with the Prionen? This cannot be, Serli muttered. Apato turned to her. I didn't mean to shock you, Captain Serli. One thing we learned while we have been here is that we do not age. We do not know how it works, but none of us have aged. How is that possible? Serli asked as she knelt. Arya walked over to her and smiled. The young Porukian child extended her hand and Serli grasped it gently. Do you remember her? Apato asked the child. Arya nodded. I gave her the purple flower. At Arya's words, Serli felt her heart on fire. Arya did remember her after all these years. Serli couldn't believe it. Yes, you did, Serli said as she pulled out the glass-encased purple flower. Arya's eyes beamed as she tried to reach for it. Serli gave it to her. Why do you do this to the flower? Arya asked. So I could keep it with me, Serli said. Arya began twirling it around her hands before passing it back to Serli. Does that mean the flower will never die? Something like that, Serli said. Serli felt her inner being crying out for joy. She couldn't explain the feeling and didn't want to mention it in front of Apato. To him, she was Captain Serli. She had no intention of changing that image of her. The feelings of joy continued to overwhelm her senses as she held Arya's hand. Eventually the child let go and stepped back. You can go back and sit down, Apato said. Arya turned around and returned to her bunk bed. Serli resisted every temptation to go and sit with Arya on the bed. That would make Apato suspicious. She had to maintain his respect, even in front of Arya. Serli turned to Apato. What do you mean you don't age? Apato shook his head. As you would expect, we didn't realize that in the initial year we were kept here. But then we began to suspect something was wrong. Over time, we realized the aging process had stopped for all of us. I know it sounds incredible, but as you can see from Arya, she hasn't aged since the day you met her on PR-45. Did the Flitera species ever mention it? Serli asked. The Flitera do not talk to us like I'm talking to you right now, Apato replied. We are merely their slaves to do what they order us to do. Serli gestured to him and they slipped out of the room. She was again tempted to glance back at Arya but decided against it. There was so much that was unknown in this dimension and in Sia's. Serli needed to gather more information. Have any of you tried to leave? Serli asked once they were back in the corridor. No. Serli couldn't comprehend it. He must have seen her facial expression. Captain Serli, I know what you're thinking. As Porukians, it's unlike us to be so subservient to the Flitera species. But you need to remember that these are workers who had no future under the Poruk Empire. Their future was working in the weapons factory on PR-45. These workers never hoped for anything more. PR-45 was more than enough for them. So, when they were put to work here in Sias, no one tried to mount an escape. The Porukians simply accepted that they would work here for the rest of their lives. But since you do not age, that could be forever, Serli said. Apato lowered his voice. I've often thought about that and even considered finding a way out. I am but one Porukian and I have to think of Arya and her welfare. Serli began to understand Apato's dilemma. The very nature of Imperial Command to get workers to work on PR-45 had become their weakness, a weakness that the Prionen and Flitera species had successfully leveraged upon. Serli clenched her fists. She couldn't let this continue, but it wasn't so simple. There were many complications, none of which she wanted to discuss openly with Apato. She dismissed those thoughts and began thinking of a way to get out of this place. Chapter 14, Unknown Planet Neutral Zone. Siobhan felt something nudging against her head. She opened her eyes only to see Lile standing in front of her. Lile's weapon touched Siobhan's head. Finally awake, are we? Lile scowled. I thought you wouldn't wake up at all. Siobhan staggered backwards until her body hit a boulder. Lile stood still. I wouldn't try to run away. There's no place to go. Siobhan flicked her eyes to the left and the right. Her weapon was nowhere to be seen. Stand up, Lile ordered. Siobhan slowly got to her feet. Bursts of pain crawled over her back. Despite that, she stared defiantly at the female Aboax. Lile shifted her weapon around in an arc. Although you have sabotaged my plans, I have decided not to kill you. There are other ways to accomplish what I need to get done. And for that, I need you to stay alive. Siobhan remained emotionless. She refused to show the female Aboax any sign of relief. Lile was untrustworthy. Siobhan needed time to think. Why are you doing this? Lile twirled her weapon. We all have our needs. If you haven't figured it out yet, mine is simple. Credits, Siobhan said softly. You aren't that stupid for a UHA commander, Lile sneered. Although I know I would be a better commander to Gibson. The hint of jealousy was not missed by Siobhan. Lile was getting even more unstable. Gibson would never be able to tolerate her as his commander. If you like Gibson so much, why are you betraying him? Siobhan retorted. Where did you ever get the idea that I liked Gibson? Lile asked. Gibson messed up my life. I'll never forgive him for that. Now, get moving. We're heading back to the Vicro. Siobhan obeyed and began to march towards the hill. After a little while, the Vicro came into view. Siobhan glanced around. She couldn't let Lile restrain her inside the vessel. If that happened, there would be no way for her to escape. Why do you want to destroy the portal? Siobhan asked. That's none of your... Weapons fire erupted around him. Lile was caught by surprise. That was all that Siobhan needed. She didn't care where the weapons fire was coming from. All she cared about was that it had provided an opening, which she had to take advantage of. Siobhan broke into a run. Where are you going? Lile hollered, but her words were drowned out by the relentless weapons fire. Siobhan knew it was from a vessel. However, she didn't look up. Instead, she raced towards the Vicro. That was her way out of here. She could only hope that the hatch wasn't locked. If the hatch was locked, she would need to find cover. The weapons fire continued behind her. Siobhan suspected Lile was returning fire. If whoever was firing could keep Lile occupied, that would help. Upon reaching the Vicro, she pressed on the panel and the hatch opened. Siobhan exhaled a sigh of relief as she raced into the vessel and locked the hatch. Now, she just needed to fly this vessel. Chapter 15, Sias, 845 Dimension. Gibson had been seated at a table staring at his wife Leanne for the last 15 minutes. Leanne hadn't aged a bit since the last time Gibson had seen her. It was incredible, but also troubling. However, Gibson let his wife share about what had been going on in Sias. Charlie had been stunned to discover that Gibson was Leanne's husband. Eventually, Charlie had withdrawn to let the two of them have a bit of space. I never thought I'd see you again, Leanne said. Gibson held her hands. I know. I didn't believe it when Laura told me about you. Leanne shifted in her seat. Laura? What does Laura have to do with this? Gibson swallowed hard. He couldn't keep it a secret. He shared with his wife about Laura and her abduction by the Prionen species, and how she and the rest of the scientists were being forced to work to ensure everyone's safety here in Sias. Leanne's face turned pale. I didn't know. Gibson tried to reassure his wife. There was no way you or anyone could know. We all thought you and the others died in the attack on Beta 6. What about Laura? Leanne asked. Once I get you out of here, I'll go and get Laura from the Toaxi species, Gibson highlighted. Get me out of here? Leanne asked. Gibson lowered his voice. You cannot stay here. We need to get you back to our dimension. That's why I came into this dimension. Leanne frowned. It isn't that simple, Gibson. Once we realized no one was going to come looking for us, people felt they had been abandoned by UHA. Then that feeling of despair settled over us. In the end, all of us here decided this was our fate and tried to make the best of it. Gibson had been worried about exactly this scenario. His short talk with Charlie had already hinted at the fact that the humans had become comfortable in their enslavement. But are you willing to escape now? Gibson asked. He needed to know. If his wife was also resistant to his idea, then the challenges in front of him were immense. No one would believe him if his own wife wasn't convinced, and all the effort expended to try and locate her would have been wasted. To Gibson's relief, Leanne didn't hesitate. I'm ready to get out of here. Seeing you has given me hope. I never imagined I'd see you again. It's like a second chance for us and our family. Gibson felt for his wife. She had suffered so long in the hands of the Prionen species. His chest tightened thinking of the years lost. However, that wasn't important now. They had been reunited and he wasn't going to let anything separate them again. But it won't be easy to convince the others, Leanne said, glancing around. The rest of the people have made their home here. I know it sounds shocking because in the end, this is a prison and we are their slaves. I can see that. But I cannot take everyone out at this moment. The risk would be high. So would the chances of failure. I'll get you out of here first and return for the rest later. If any of us is not here during the head count check, the rest will suffer, Leanne sighed. That's what the Flitera species told us. Gibson suppressed a sigh. That thought had been lurking in his mind ever since the drones had done the visual head count. I also don't think you'll be able to convince Charlie of your plans to take me away from here, Leanne stated. He's a bigger problem than the Flitera species. He ensures everything runs smoothly. He has become like the de facto leader, so much so that the Flitera species appear to trust him. Gibson was surprised that Charlie hadn't divulged any such information to him. It had been intentional on his part. Leanne was right. If what she mentioned was really the situation on the ground, Charlie was going to be a bigger problem than Gibson had expected. Chapter 16, Unknown Planet Neutral Zone. Once Siobhan sat down at the empty cockpit, she glanced around the controls. She pressed on the console. The lights inside the vessel came on and the engines began to hum. The faint sound of weapons fire continued to penetrate the vessel. She grabbed hold of the controls and navigated the vessel off the surface. Siobhan chuckled, imagining what Lile must be witnessing out there. The female Aboax had to be seething, knowing that Siobhan had commandeered her vessel. Siobhan brought the Vicro around. There was no sign of Lile. The female Aboax was clever. She must have taken cover. Then alerts began to light up across the console. Siobhan sighed. It was an enemy vessel. She navigated the Vicro away from the surface. As the vessel began to climb into the atmosphere, more alerts lit up. Siobhan checked the console. Incoming missiles. She looked frantically around for the button to release the countermeasures. The console wasn't as easy to read as that of a UHA vessel. She chided herself for not taking the time to get familiar with the console. Eventually, she found the button and released the countermeasures as the Vicro banked to the left. Then the comms came on from the console. You won't make it far. I hope you die out there. It was Lile. Siobhan wasn't surprised that the female Aboax was still alive. Do you hear me? Lile shouted through the comms. If you survive this, I'll come for you and make you pay for stealing my vessel. Siobhan had enough of Lile's voice and switched off the comms. She needed to focus on the enemy vessel. It had to be the Toaxi. There weren't any other vessels around here that would be interested in the portal. Then a hail appeared on her console. Siobhan turned it on. Unidentified vessels, stand down and will not destroy you, a voice boomed from the console. Who am I talking to? Siobhan asked. This is Toaxi vessel AT-23. The voice replied. This planet is part of Toaxi space. You are trespassing. Stand down and surrender or we'll destroy you. Siobhan didn't believe the Toaxi at all. Since when is this planet under Toaxi space? You dare to question me, a Toaxi voice shouted. With that, the comms went dead. Siobhan grimaced. That had been a shorter than expected conversation. She didn't care and had no intention of landing this vessel or giving it up to the Toaxi species. By now, the Vicro had reached orbit. Siobhan checked the console. There was one red dot approaching her from behind. It had to be the Toaxi vessel. Siobhan pushed down on the controls which sent the Vicro barreling down to the surface. The Toaxi vessel seemed to have been caught off guard as it didn't immediately follow the Vicro. That gave Siobhan more than sufficient time to analyze the surface. She wasn't going back anywhere near the portal's position. Instead, the sensor readings identified a large crater east of the portal's position. Then everything clicked in place. Siobhan navigated the Vicro in the direction of that crater. Glancing back at the sensors, the Toaxi vessel had finally begun to make its descent through the atmosphere. Siobhan pushed on the thrusters as the Vicro accelerated towards the crater. In a matter of seconds, the crater began to expand on the view screen. She only had one shot at this maneuver. Once the Vicro passed over the southern edge of the crater, the vessel straightened its descent and began to crawl along the surface. Sensor readings indicated that the Toaxi vessel had just passed the southern edge. Siobhan had to time it perfectly. She turned the vessel around sharply and brought it to a halt. Then she increased the thrusters. The Vicro started on a collision course with the Toaxi vessel. But the Toaxi vessel didn't know it yet. Then the Toaxi vessel came up on the view screen. It had just reached the bottom of the crater. Siobhan didn't wait. It was now or never. She launched a volley of missiles at the Toaxi vessel. Then she pulled up on the controls as the Vicro went near vertical, climbing out of the crater. In hindsight, the idea had sounded great when she had recited it in her head, but as the Vicro climbed, Siobhan felt her stomach churn. Her head began to get dizzy. Her hands began to shake. She needed to hold on just a little bit longer. The multiple actions by the Vicro caught the Toaxi vessel by surprise. For a little while, the Toaxi vessel didn't react. That was more than enough time for Siobhan. She pushed back down on the controls and the Vicro sped back down to the surface. But now it was right behind the Toaxi vessel, which had begun evasive maneuvers to dodge the missiles. Siobhan fired the plasma weapon. Streaks of plasma raced down to the crater's surface and hit their intended target. The Toaxi vessel suffered multiple hits, resulting in breaches. A few seconds later, the Toaxi vessel exploded into a ball of flames. Siobhan raised her fist and shouted for joy. If Lily had been able to see it, the female Abuax would have been forced to shut her mouth. Chapter 17, Sia's A45 Dimension. Gibson stared at Leanne's room. She shared it with another woman. The room had 2 bunk beds, a table, chairs, and several cabinets. He had to admit that it wasn't a prison cell. In fact, it was much better than any prison cell he had ever seen. On the left side of the room was a small makeshift counter with some food and drinks on it. Where's the woman you shared this room with? Gibson asked as he sat down. Emily and I work on alternate shifts, Leanne replied. It's the Flitera species' way of keeping the assembly line running all the time. Fortunately, my shift had just ended when the Flitera species called for a head count check. Gibson doubted the Flitera species had come up with the idea of continuous shifts. He suspected the Prionen behind it. The more Gibson learned about the Prionen species, the more he realized how dangerous they were. Apparently, enslavement and efficiency were amongst their core tenets. You mean the head count checks aren't done at a fixed time of the day? Gibson inquired. They mostly are, but sometimes the Flitera like to call for random head count checks. I think it's just to keep us on our toes. In recent months, it hasn't happened as much. Other than being the de facto leader, what else does Charlie do? Gibson asked. I've seen him work on the weapons assembly line, Leanne said. I think he does other things as well, but we don't know what they are. Gibson had also found out that there was a mess-like dining hall where everyone in their shifts gathered to eat before and after their shifts. Leanne sat opposite him. There's something else you should know. Emily and I found out a few years ago that we aren't the only species here in Sias. Gibson raised his eyebrows. What do you mean? I mean there are other species being forced to work in Sias. One time we saw a young Porukian child trying to climb to our level in this facility, but the child eventually returned to a level. Neither I nor Emily ever told anyone about it. Gibson had suspected that all along. It also explained the disappearance of Serli. The Prionen species had not only abducted humans, but Porukians and other species. The Prionen species were enslaving multiple species to do their bidding. Leanne had been wise not to tell Charlie. Somehow, Gibson had a bad feeling about Charlie. Do you know where the weapons go? Gibson asked. Leanne shook her head. After they're assembled, they disappear from this level. That's what we've been told. Let me guess, Charlie told you all about it. Leanne nodded reluctantly. Charlie's close affiliation to the Flitera species was disturbing. Was Charlie really working with the Flitera species? Gibson couldn't tell, but he regretted telling Charlie of how he came to see us. Then he felt a faint sound coming from behind him. He swirled around, but there was nothing. Leanne looked alarmed. What's wrong? The faint sound continued to resonate. Gibson then realized it was coming from behind his head. His fingers touched the back of his head. His fingertips felt a slight vibration. Had the Flitera species done something else to him while he had been in the pod? His fingertips grazed something circular on the nape of his neck. Leanne, can you see if there's something there? Leanne stood and walked around him. Then she gasped. Chapter 18, Sia's Other Dimension. Serli pressed on the device at the base of her neck. It was a small, circular one that wasn't easily visible to the naked eye. During the Pinnacle War, Imperial Command had required the circular device be implanted on all its captains and designated staff. The captain of a vessel had also been given an additional set of devices. Each captain could then implant the device on anyone as needed. En route to the planet in the neutral zone, Serli had decided to plant one discreetly on Captain Gibson, without his knowledge. She had done it carefully while helping him with his helmet before they had left the Wicro. Gibson hadn't noticed a thing. All Serli had needed to do was gently press it on his neck and the device would do the rest. The circular device provided a means of encrypted comms between two or more parties within a short radius. She suspected that Gibson wasn't too far and within the radius of the circular device. She had initiated the comms handshake, but Gibson hadn't reciprocated. Serli sighed. She had hoped Gibson would have been able to understand what was going on. However, it seemed the UHA captain hadn't. Not yet, at least. She pressed on the device again and decided to wait. Gibson wasn't stupid. He would eventually figure it out. Serli glanced around the room. A pato had brought her to an empty one. It had 2 bunks, a table, chairs, and a counter. Once Apato had left her alone, Serli had begun mulling the next steps. However, every time she tried to focus, Aria would come to her mind. A heavy burden had lifted off her knowing that Aria had survived the attack on PR-41, an attack that Serli herself had ordered. Years of regret had melted away, but it had been replaced with anxiety, unlike anything she had ever felt before. She had to help the Porukians get away from their enslavement. But helping them meant revealing their presence to Imperial Command. Once Imperial Command discovered that the workers on PR-45 had survived, they would enforce their termination. It was a non-negotiable protocol. Another part of the Poruk Code. Either the workers continued on their designated planet in the supply chain, or they were terminated. Serli didn't know how many workers had been previously terminated in the supply chain by Imperial Command, and she didn't want to hazard a guess. However, no one had faced a current unique situation where the workers had been transported to another dimension as slaves. To the Prionen species, these workers were valuable, not only because they had gained experience in working on weapons on PR-45, but because no one was looking for them. Everyone had thought these workers had perished on PR-45. Aria's face again dominated her thoughts. She couldn't let the Poruk child die, not again. Serli knew she would never be able to live with herself. To Imperial Command, she would be deemed a failure. Another Poruk captain who had succumbed to the wages of war. Then a voice emerged. Who is this? What have you done to me? It was about time that Gibson figured out what was going on. This is Serli Gibson, Serli announced. There was a long pause before Gibson continued. "What the heck did you do to me? Please understand, Captain, that it was a precaution I had to take before we left the weak row," Serli said, "in case we got separated." Gibson didn't sound pleased at all. "You could have told me. A little trust goes a long way, Serli." Serli sighed. Gibson was right. She should have trusted him with the device. Again, the years of mistrust between Porukians and humans had stubbornly reared its ugly head. There was no one left to blame but herself. She had to accept it. Gibson must have sensed her struggle. "It doesn't matter right now. I probably would have tried the same thing if I had such a device. I presume you are at another level with the Porukians. Am I correct?" "Yes," Serli replied. "And you have humans at your level. We need to find a way to get to one another soon." "I've been told you are one level below us," Gibson commented. "It seems some time back a young child tried to climb to our level but failed." Serli looked up. It had to be Area. There was no other young child amongst the Porukians serving the Prionen and Flitera species. "I'll attempt that shortly," Serli said, and the comms ended. She could imagine that Gibson would be seething. If Serli had been in Gibson's boots, she would probably have had the same reaction. Serli struggled with her past. She had to break free from the chains of mistrust and cooperate with the humans. If not, they weren't going to get out of this dimension alive. First things first, though. She had to find Area and ask the child from where she had tried to climb to the next level. Chapter 19, Sia's A45 dimension. Gibson checked his device. Time wasn't their friend today. His wife's shift would start in another few hours. Leanne looked exhausted. She should have gotten some rest, but she insisted on being by his side. Gibson didn't argue with her. He also didn't want to lose sight of her, not again. Charlie hadn't come back to look for them. Gibson had been relieved. The de facto leader was probably attending to the assembly line. Gibson still couldn't come to grips with the fact that Charlie was possibly working with the Flitera species. "How much longer?" Leanne asked. Leanne had brought him to a room at the end of the corridor. This was where they had spotted the Porukian child. The room itself was empty. Gibson could only hope that Serli would be able to find the child who had tried to escape. The child should be around. If everything was the same at Serli's level, Gibson imagined the child would still be a child. It was as if everyone enslaved here in this dimension was frozen in time. He didn't understand what led to that phenomena. Then, a scratching sound pierced the silence in the room. Leanne walked over to the window and looked down. "Your Porukian friend is coming up." The window was only a window by namesake. It didn't reveal anything outside of this structure. Instead, the window overlooked a wall. However, there was sufficient space between the wall and the structure for someone to crawl along. Gibson appreciated the makers of this factory for that benefit. Gibson frowned. Serli wasn't his friend, but he didn't have time to explain the intricacies of his relationship with the Poruk Captain to his wife. A few moments later, Serli stood in front of him. She didn't look like someone who had just climbed from one level to this room. He guessed it was a Porukian thing. "It's good to see you're alive," Gibson muttered. He hoped he sounded sincere. But the fact that the Poruk Captain had planted the device on him without his consent still bothered him. Serli nodded and then looked at Leanne. Before Gibson could say anything, Leanne extended her hand. "My name's Leanne. I'm Gibson's wife." He observed Serli's body stiffen before shaking his wife's hand. Then Serli turned to him. Her facial expression didn't even try to hide the confusion. Gibson's voice trailed off. Serli raised her hands. "No need to explain. Below this level are a group of Porukians who I thought had died a long time ago, but it seemed they had been transported here by the Prionen. They're also working on an assembly line. I assume the same is happening at this level with your kind." Gibson's suspicions were correct. The Prionen strategy was sinister. They abducted groups whom everyone else assumed had died. He had to admit it was a clever one. All the Prionen had to do was observe and wait for the right moment to execute their abduction. "Except we have one problem," Gibson highlighted. "There's a man who leads the humans here. We suspect he's working with the Flitera species." Gibson shared with Serli about Charlie. Despite that, he didn't know if Charlie was the only problem they would need to face. Charlie was but one figure. He didn't know if Charlie had the backing of other humans. He had asked Leanne about it, but she had been unable to give him a reassuring response. How do you know he's working with the Flutera species? Serli asked. It's a hunch, Leanne replied. What's a hunch? Serli asked. A guess, Leanne corrected. Serli nodded. Even if that's the case, we need to find out a way out of Sias. We don't even know what's outside of the structure, Gibson said. According to my wife, none of the humans have ever ventured outside. Do any of the Porukians know about what is beyond this structure? Serli shook her head. I need to go, Leanne said. Gibson sighed. He didn't like losing sight of his wife, but he had to let her go. Her shift was starting soon. If she wasn't around, it would alert Charlie. You must stay here, Leanne advised. No one ventures out here. I'll be back in 6 hours. Gibson was still reluctant to let his wife go, but his choices were limited. If they wanted to mount a successful escape, he needed to be patient. The last thing he needed was for Charlie to be suspicious and become an obstacle. His wife hugged him and left him and Serli alone in the room. Chapter 20, Sias, A45 Dimension. Serli sat down cross-legged on the bare floor. Her mind hadn't yet finished processing the fact that she had found Gibson with his wife, but now she understood the reasons behind Gibson's desperation. It actually all made sense. This was why Gibson had agreed to Lile's proposal. You knew your wife was here, Serli asked. They had nothing to do but wait, so Serli felt it was as good a time as any to talk things out with Gibson. Gibson joined her on the floor. One of the scientists that was kidnapped by the Twaxi was my only daughter, Laura. She told me that the Prionen species showed her an image of my wife. I had no choice but to find my wife. Even to the point of using Lile, I was desperate. Gibson's actions all fell into place. It was a typical human response. Something a Porukian wouldn't do, but humans were different. And you found her against all odds, Serli remarked. Gibson smiled weakly. I was never sure if the Prionen had faked those images. Until I saw her, I tried to keep my hopes in check. Serli found Gibson's frankness refreshing. It was the first time she was having an open conversation with a captain. In her time as captain, Serli had never gotten the opportunity to connect with other Poruk captains. After everything that had happened, she suspected Trez had something to do with it. Maybe Serli's closeness to the Poruk vice-chancellor had intimidated the rest. Or maybe that was the way Imperial Command preferred it. Did you find anyone down there that you know? Gibson asked. Serli hesitated. Could she trust this human? She didn't know, but she knew Trez was no longer trustworthy. Then who else was left? Unfortunately, she had no one. Serli decided to take a chance. She would handle any repercussions of her decision later. Serli shared about the incident at PR-45, the workers, area, the galactic weapon, and the supply chain. Surprisingly, Gibson didn't say a word. He listened, and after she had finished, he stared at her. It was an uncomfortable silence. Gibson then extended his hand to her. She didn't know what he was doing, but grasped it. You did something that I never thought a Porukian would ever do, Gibson said as he shook her hand, especially a Poruk captain. You mean tell the truth? No, choose to trust a human. I know it goes against your Poruk Code. How do you know of our code? Serli asked. Gibson grinned. There are many things I know about Poruk society. The awkward silence returned. Serli glanced up at the ceiling and then the door, anywhere but Gibson's face. Does that mean those Porukians down there can never return to our dimension? Gibson asked. Serli nodded reluctantly. It's an Imperial Command protocol. I don't have a choice but to follow it. We always have a choice. As a human you do, but as Porukians... Gibson frowned. Are you telling me you're going to leave area in this dimension when we escape? Serli closed her eyes. Her head was pounding. Gibson was perceptive. He had gotten to the heart of the matter. He knew she had a strong connection to Area, or maybe she had inadvertently revealed it in the way she had talked about Area. Aria's face swirled in her thoughts. Serli opened her eyes and glared at him. It's not that simple. Am I correct to say that you're going to let those Porukian workers stay here forever? Gibson asked. Why was Gibson pressing her on this issue? He had found his wife. That should be enough for him. The Porukians were none of his business. He had no say on their lives. No one will kill them, Serli said. One day the Prionen will no longer need them, Gibson countered. It may not be for a while, but that time will come. I cannot defy the Poruk Code, Serli insisted. You think you know me, but you do not. Adherence to protocol above all else. It was another aspect that formed the foundation of the Poruk Code, which he had sworn an oath to protect. Gibson lowered his voice. I know I have no right to interfere into the Poruk way of life. Serli shot him a glance. That's correct. Stay out of my affairs. But as a human, I cannot sit by and let innocents die, Gibson commented. Even if they are Porukians, no one deserves to be enslaved in this dimension. No one. Serli stared at him and sighed. I didn't mean to put you in a corner, Gibson continued. All I'm saying is that every one of us has a choice. I fully understand being under command and following protocols, but I also know when we need to make the hard choices. I made the hard choice many years ago, Serli insisted, and it has haunted me for so long. I was never able to get over it. I suppressed it for years. Not a day went by when I didn't think of Arya and what I did to her and all those Porukian workers. I told myself I was just following orders. Every time I said it, I thought it would make me feel better. But it didn't. My own words were hollow, an excuse of a coward. Serli felt a huge burden lift off as she unloaded everything she had suppressed for so long. She couldn't put into words the freedom inside of her. Then she felt Gibson's hand on her shoulder. Now you have a chance to redeem yourself, Gibson said. Gibson must have noticed the confusion on her face. I mean, you have a second chance to fix your past. Make the right choice this time. Make it count. Serli paused for a long moment. I'll try. She had a second chance. That was true. She couldn't fail Arya and the workers again. Once had been enough. She had punished herself too long for it. It was time to move on from her past mistakes. She couldn't hide behind the Poruk Code any longer. She had been weak in giving in to the Poruk Code at the expense of innocent lives. It was time to change. She had to change. Not only for her sake, but for those Porukians' sake. One more thing, Gibson commented. Don't ever put something on me again without my knowledge. You could have just asked me. I would have agreed with your plan. We need to trust each other going forward. Got it? Serli nodded. Chapter 21, Sia's A45 Dimension. What do you mean you don't have a head count check? Serli asked. Apato shrugged. We never had such a thing. The Flitera ensure we do our task and leave us be. As long as we hit the quota set by them, they don't seem to care about our whereabouts. Serli stared at him in disbelief. After her talk with Gibson, he had encouraged her to return to her level and talk with Apato about bringing Arya along during the escape. Climbing back down hadn't been as hard as the initial climb. However, Serli had taken every precaution possible and executed the climb slowly. Hearing that there wasn't any head count check done for the Porukians at this level made things easier. I think I know why, Serli sighed. Apato looked at her in confusion. The Prionen and Flitera species know that the Porukians they abducted cannot return to our dimension, Serli said. They know of the Imperial Command protocols. They may even know enough of our Poruk Code, so they don't need to keep an eye on you. The humans above are a different matter altogether. Because if we return, we'll be killed, Apato commented. Yes. The Prionen species had been very calculating in selecting the Porukian workers from PR-45. But what bothered Serli was how the Prionen knew of the Imperial Command protocols. Was it by observation? If so, the Prionen must have been closely listening in on the conversations of those workers on PR-45. If it was through another means that hinted at the possibility that the Prionen species had spies in the Poruk Empire, even potentially within the sanctity of Imperial Command, Apato shrugged. Then we are stuck here forever. Serli wasn't going to give up so easily. What if I take you back to our dimension and leave you on a neutral planet, one where the Poruk Empire wouldn't look for you? No one would come looking for you. It would be safe. Serli couldn't guarantee their safety forever back in her dimension, but it was better than this enslavement. Anything was better than this. Apato's eyes widened. Captain Serli, you would be openly defying the Poruk Code. Do you know? Serli didn't need him to remind her of it. I'm aware, and I thought it through carefully. This is the only chance for your group, unless there are Porukians here who want to stay enslaved forever. None of us want to stay here. Are you certain? Yes, Apato replied. The humans up there may be different, but we Porukians don't enjoy this forced labor. Serli found this statement ironic. The Porukians had been forced to work on PR-45 for years, but now facing the Flitera, their taste had changed. But I cannot take everyone now, Serli said. I'll first take you, Arya, and her mother. Once I settle you down on a planet, I'll return for the rest. It's only me and Arya. Where's her mother? Apato looked away. She died a long time ago on PR-45 before the attack. She got this unknown sickness and died quickly. There was nothing I could do for her. She made me promise to take care of Arya. We performed the Porukian ritual and buried her. She's in a better place. Serli didn't know what else to say. She sighed. Grieving the losses was another thing that she had let Imperial Command strip away from her, all because of her desire to prove that she was worthy to command a Poruk vessel. She began to question if it all had been worth it. Apato eyed her. Captain Serli, there's nothing to say about it. I also went against Imperial Command protocols by having a child with her. I knew I shouldn't have, but I let my guard down. I always felt losing Arya's mother was my punishment. Again, Serli felt awkward talking so frankly with another Porukian. With Gibson, she had found it easier because he was a human. But with Apato, it was challenging. Despite that, she tried her best. Can you get Arya ready, Serli asked, and tell the rest of the workers to be patient. We'll come back for them. Apato nodded and left her in the corridor. One big problem loomed ahead of them. They didn't have a plan. Not yet. Once she got Apato and Arya to the level above, she would need to discuss it with Gibson. Chapter 22, Sia's A45 Dimension. Gibson smiled at Arya. The young Porukian child cast him a sheepish smile. He had been impressed that both Apato and Arya had been able to do the climb to this level without any help. Arya was courageous. Apato didn't look as fit as Serli, but he had made it. Apato shook his hands. Captain Gibson, thank you for helping us. You can thank me once we are back in our dimension, Gibson remarked. Apato nodded. Do you have a plan? Gibson exchanged looks with Serli. We'll have one soon. Why don't you and your daughter just get some rest? Let me and Serli handle the next steps. I understand, Captain, Apato said. Then Apato gestured to Arya and the both of them went to one corner of the room and sat down. The Porukian child had in her hands a few small objects which Gibson couldn't recognize. Those objects probably had something to do with her Porukian heritage. Gibson turned to Serli. I understand a bit better why you were affected by Arya. She's a charming child. Serli lowered her voice. We need to find a way out of here. Gibson bit his lip. He had been racking his brain trying to think of any way out, but nothing had come to mind. The problem remained that they didn't know what was outside of the structure. Serli had told him the structure seemed to have about 10 levels that made this place quite big. However, that information was just the beginning. Was this structure within the forest, or was it amongst the sand dunes or somewhere else? Then there was a shuffling sound outside the door. Gibson motioned for everyone to remain quiet as he walked over to the door. He checked his device. 6 hours hadn't gone by yet. It couldn't be Liane. Something was wrong. Serli took a position on the other side of the door. Neither he nor the Poruk Captain had any weapons. There was a click and the door slid open. Gibson didn't wait. He yanked the figure into the room. Don't kill me, the figure pleaded, raising her hands over her face. It was a woman. Gibson let go of her. My name's Emily, the figure said. Emily was his wife's roommate. What was she doing here? You must be Liane's husband, Emily said. Why are you here? Gibson asked. He was sure Liane wouldn't have asked her roommate to come here. Emily's body stiffened as she glanced at Serli, Apato, and Arya. Charlie sent me to pass you a message. Gibson swallowed hard. He shouldn't have let Liane go off to do her shift. Something had happened to her. Gibson grabbed Emily by the hands. Is my wife alive? Where is she? Let her talk, Serli interjected. Gibson realized he was holding Emily's hands tightly and shaking her. He let go and took a step back. His mind began to race at what Charlie was doing to his wife. Gibson struggled to stay in control, but he had to, for his wife's sake. Emily looked shaken by his actions. Charlie has her. He told me to tell you to meet him. When and where? Gibson asked. In 10 minutes, Emily replied in a shaky voice. I'm supposed to bring you there. Bring me where? Gibson asked. I cannot tell you, Emily insisted. Please just follow Charlie's orders, then Leanne will be safe. Emily couldn't understand the danger his wife was in. If Charlie was really working for the Flitera species, there was no way Gibson was going to trust a man with his wife. Serli touched his shoulder. I have a plan. Chapter 23, Sia's A45 Dimension. Gibson's heart was racing as he followed Emily down the corridor and back into a large chamber. He was still upset with himself for letting Leanne go back to her shift work. Leanne would have told him that there was no other way. Despite that, the current situation had emerged because of Leanne returning to work, and he had permitted it. Gibson couldn't shake that fact off. Emily led him towards the end of the chamber and down another corridor. Where's everyone? Gibson muttered. Our work isn't done in this chamber, if that's what you're asking, Emily replied. There are smaller chambers linked by an assembly line where we do the work. Does that mean you don't interact with others while doing your shift? Gibson asked. We don't. The only time we interact with each other is during our meal times. When we came here, that's the way things were arranged. No one questioned it then. Gibson suspected Sias was a facility that had been used by other species before the arrival of humans. When you take me to Charlie, I would advise you not to say anything about the Porukians you saw back there, Gibson warned. Emily nodded. I won't. I don't understand why Charlie is doing this. He has never before harmed any one of us. He's always been a great leader taking care of us in this place. Gibson suppressed a sigh. Emily seemed to respect Charlie. However, Gibson didn't know if that respect would take a beating ever since Charlie had decided to hold Leanne against her will. Emily stopped at her door. We are here. She pressed on the panel and the door slid open. Gibson stepped inside after Emily. The room wasn't what he had expected. It was a well-furnished room lined with a plush carpet and brightly colored walls. Welcome, Gibson, a voice echoed. Gibson turned his gaze in the direction of the voice. Charlie was seated along a round table that was situated on the left side of the room. Leanne was seated next to him. One look at Leanne's face told Gibson everything. Emily, you can leave us now, Charlie said. Emily turned around and left the room. Leanne had a shocked expression on her face. His wife hadn't expected Emily to be so obedient, but it was as Gibson had suspected. Emily didn't want to get in the middle of any problems. The woman appeared to be content with her faith in Sias. Come and take a seat, Charlie motioned. Gibson couldn't see Charlie's hands. He guessed one of them was holding a weapon pointed at Leanne. Gibson took a few steps forward and sat at an empty seat opposite Charlie and Leanne. Do you know what happened today? Charlie smirked. I'm sure you're about to tell me, Gibson replied. Charlie smacked his hand on the table. That I am. Gibson, nothing gets past you. I'm guessing you even knew we were going to have this conversation. Gibson had enough of the idle chatter. What do you want? Now we are talking, Charlie said. Let's not waste time, Gibson countered. I want you to leave Sias, Charlie announced. Chapter 24, Sias A45 Dimension. Gibson nearly laughed out loud. Do you think I'm joking? Charlie scowled. Charlie then briefly lifted his hand to reveal the weapon pointed at Leanne. It was a short, blaster-like weapon. The Flitera must have given it to Charlie. That only confirmed his alliance with the Flitera species. I'm not leaving without my wife, Gibson countered. You are not in a position to negotiate with me, Charlie retorted. You shouldn't have been brought here. It was a mistake. But now I'm giving you a chance to leave Sias. No one has ever been given that chance before. No one. Gibson eyed the man. He couldn't reconcile why Charlie would want him out of Sias. It didn't make any sense, especially since the Flitera species had brought him here. Why was he second-guessing the Flitera species' intentions? Or was this all about the fact that Leanne was Gibson's wife? Gibson threw him an amused look. Is that what your Flitera buddies told you? Did you have a nice chat with them about me? Charlie's mouth hung open briefly before he looked away. His surprised look hadn't gone unnoticed by Leanne. I cannot believe it, Leanne admitted. Have you been working with the Flitera all this time? Just shut up, Charlie hollered. Why would you sell your own kind out? Gibson asked. I don't know what you're talking about, Charlie replied. This is the very reason you need to leave. You're nothing but trouble. I sensed it the first time I set my eyes on you. We humans have been toiling day and night under the Flitera. The Flitera have been patient with us all these years. Now you show up and try to disrupt that. The Flitera will kill us if we choose to defy them. Is that you or the Flitera talking? Gibson asked. Then Charlie stood, lifting Leanne with him. The weapon pointed at her side was now more obvious. Gibson stood and looked at him. Don't make this more difficult than it should be, Charlie warned. I don't want to escalate matters any further than necessary. Gibson doubted Charlie's sincerity. The man was scared of Gibson's presence. Charlie knew Gibson would upset his operation in Sias. Gibson swept his hand around the room. Is this what the Flitera gave you in return for your undivided loyalty to them? Charlie raised his voice. You don't understand what we went through. When we all came here, we didn't know what to do. So I took the chance to organize ourselves. If not for me, this group wouldn't have made it this far. You organize yourself into slaves, Gibson commented. Is that what you mean? My instructions are simple, Charlie said. The Flitera have agreed to let you go. This is your chance. Get out of here. Gibson pointed at his wife. Not without her. You must know I'm not going to abandon my wife. Don't you have a family? Charlie tightened his grip on Leanne. Gibson knew he was treading dangerously with this man. My personal life is none of your business, Charlie sneered. Let me make this crystal clear to you. If you don't leave, I'll shoot your wife in front of you. Then you can carry her dead body out of here. Gibson didn't believe Charlie's bluff. Won't killing a human reduce your efficiency in producing the weapons? Gibson inquired. There are always ways to improve our efficiency, Charlie said. I'm going to ask you one more time. Then her blood is on your hands. Leave here. Gibson raised his hands. Okay, I agree to your terms. The tension in Charlie's face slipped down a notch. What are you doing? Leanne blurted out. Charlie turned to her. Keep your mouth shut. Your husband just saved your life. How do I leave this place? Gibson asked. Turn around, Charlie instructed. When you leave my room, turn left and keep going until you reach the end of the corridor. There's a door there. Knock on it and a Flitera will open it for you. Am I supposed to believe that the Flitera will simply let me go free? Gibson asked as he turned around. That's what they told me, Charlie snapped. Once you leave this level, it's up to you to talk to them. Charlie's desire to stay in power was sickening. This room was evidence of it. Gibson didn't know what other benefits the Flitera had given Charlie in exchange for his loyalty to them. Start moving, Charlie ordered, and don't even think of trying anything. I'm ready, Gibson said as he took a few steps to the door. Then he pressed on the panel. The moment the door began to slide open, Gibson fell to the ground. Charlie let out a shout of pain. Chapter 25, Sias A45 Dimension. Gibson swirled around and got up. Charlie was on his knees, grasping his throat. Blood was spewing in every direction from his throat. Leanne had jumped a distance away from Charlie. Serli stood beside Gibson. She walked over to Charlie and kicked him in the face. He collapsed, turning the carpet into a red mess. Leanne raced over to Gibson and hugged him. I didn't know what was going on. For a second, I thought you were really going to leave me with this delusional man. You have Serli to thank for this. Gibson smiled. It was her idea. Leanne turned around. Thank you. It was a simple plan, Serli said. I was fortunate to have access to my kevok. Apparently, all Poruk captains had several lethal ways of neutralizing their enemies outside of their obvious weapons. Serli had briefed him on using a Poruk kevok. The kevok was like a dart, but sharper and thinner. When Serli had pulled one out of the right side of her body. Gibson had been stunned to find out that she had been able to sneak those kevok through the Flitera pods. Serli had indicated that they were hidden within her body through a tiny incision and could be easily extracted when needed. Gibson didn't dare ask what other tools the Poruk captains had at their disposal. He had felt his anxiety of trusting the Poruk captain trying to come to the fore, but he had quietly suppressed it. Serli's plan had been truly simple. Without Emily's knowledge, Serli had been able to follow Gibson to the room. Then the Poruk captain had gotten into position outside the door and waited for his signal through the comms device in his neck. Leanne stared at the slumped body on the floor. Is he dead? Completely, Serli replied. No one survives a kevok, especially a human. Then Serli began walking around the room. Search this place. There must be more weapons around. The Flitera wouldn't leave Charlie without the ability to defend himself. Leanne, guard the door, Gibson said as he joined Serli in searching the room. He moved about the walls, slowly examining them for any signs of a hidden panel. I found it, Serli announced. A panel beside her opened. Gibson's eyes widened at the array of weapons. It seems that the Flitera put a lot of faith in Charlie, Serli muttered. I still cannot believe it, Leanne lamented. How could Charlie do that to the rest of us? We trusted him. Gibson shook his head. I think we need to be careful about the rest. Did you see the way Emily was so obedient to Charlie? I felt she had a high level of respect for Charlie. Leanne nodded reluctantly. Although we never talk about Charlie, I didn't know Emily would end up like that. The fact that Leanne didn't know of Charlie's loyalty to the Flitera spoke volumes of how well the man had kept his secret from the rest of the humans all these years. He didn't know when the Flitera had reached out to Charlie, but the Flitera must have observed Charlie for some time before deciding to convert him to their side. This is quite a haul, Gibson murmured as his eyes scanned the weapons. Again, Serli looked at him in confusion. It's a lot of weapons for a single man, Gibson said. Serli nodded as she passed him a laser rifle, blaster, and a packet of grenades. She then also passed a small arms weapon to Leanne, who took it begrudgingly. Gibson suppressed a chuckle. His wife had always been dead set against weapons of any kind. He doubted her belief system would have changed in this dimension. Gibson, don't you look at me like that, Leanne sighed. Serli turned around with 3 more rifle blasters in both hands. This should be more than enough for us to get out of here. I'll pass one to Apato, who should be outside the area by now. What about the rest? Leanne asked. Serli looked at Gibson. He frowned. We need to get out of here first and then return for them. Leanne didn't say anything. His wife always showed concern for others, and she was very trusting. It was what had led her in the first place to Beta 6. However, the discovery of Charlie's affiliation to the Flitera species had probably shocked her perspective. After observing Emily, Gibson couldn't trust how close the rest of the humans were to Charlie. Gibson sidestepped Charlie's dead body as he returned to his wife's side. Serli joined them, glanced outside the door and waved to someone. Apato appeared holding onto Arya. Leanne looked at Gibson. It's a long story. Gibson sighed before introducing his wife to Apato and Arya. He observed Leanne blocking the view into the room. If Arya noticed the blood, she might scream in fear. Serli passed Apato one of the weapons. The man looked at the rifle, checked, and aimed it ahead of him. Gibson was impressed. Apato must have had some military training in the past, which made sense since he was assigned to oversee the weapons factory on PR-45. We'll move down to the end of the corridor, Serli proposed. Gibson nodded as he trained his weapon ahead of him. We need to move quickly, Leanne warned. When the shift changes, everyone comes out into the corridor. The change in shift will happen in another 30 minutes.